Okay, this is the second part of the road to the Civil War. Same objectives here, just being able to recall the major events that led to the outbreak of the war, that led up to it, and the significance of them. Why were they important to the lead up to the outbreak of the Civil War? Um, what what part of them helped cause it, essentially? So here we go. Big question here. What events led to the growing division between the North and the South that led to the Civil War during the 1850s? To kind of recap here, the last lecture was the 1850s. The nation was dealing with the spread of slavery and tried to create political compromises to settle it. The Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But we saw that both those things led to conflict over pro-slavery and anti-slavery supporters. And that just helps lead to what will eventually be the outbreak of the Civil War. Okay, the main thing on this slide that I want you to understand is that political parties have changed and shifted from the beginning of America's history to this point that we're talking about. And this slide is specifically referring to the creation of the Republican Party, which is still technically the same Republican Party that exists today. This party, the thing I want you to understand is during this time, this 1850s, this conflict over the westward expansion of slavery, it forms, and its main goal is to not kill slavery, but to stop it from spreading any further west into new territories of the United States. The very bottom of this little chart here shows that they opposed slavery. They believed that it was, property. Slave owners do have right to property, but they wanted to stop the spread of it. They also were opposed, obviously, to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They were opposed to popular sovereignty, to letting individuals vote on slavery. They didn't want it to spread at all. Okay, so here's a new event that helps cause further tension between North and the South. This is the Dred Scott decision. So, in 1857, so we're getting really close here to the outbreak of the Civil War, a slave named Dred Scott had traveled with his owner into two places where slavery was illegal. And because of this, Dred Scott, the slave, thought that he was free, and so decided he was going to try and sue for his freedom. And on the argument that because he had been in free territory, he was a free man. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. The highest court in the nation heard this court case over the freedom of a slave. And here's what the Supreme Court said. In the Supreme Court ruling, a few things were decided. That technically, Dred Scott, the slave, could not even sue because he was a slave and technically not considered a U.S. citizen. That living in a free state did not make a slave free because of this third one. Slaves were property. Owners bought them. And property is protected by the Constitution. So, Dred Scott was not granted his freedom. And in fact, even more so than that, the court made it very clear that slaves were not citizens, but merely property owned by another person. On top of that, it says Justice Taney here. That's the Supreme Court justice. The Supreme Court ruled that Congress, the national government, did not have any power to limit the spread of slavery in any territory of the United States. So things such as the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were void. Slavery could go wherever it wanted to because it was property. And this stunned the nation. Southerners, not all of them again, but slave owners in general, the South in general, was excited about this because it opened up all the territories again that were left to settle to slavery. And Northerners, who had hoped that slavery would go away, were now very fearful that slavery would overspread the rest of the continent. So again, this graphic here is very telling in this. It creates a further divide between these two sections of the United States. Okay. So I just have here saying that it says Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. This is before he's president. Abraham Lincoln had served as a congressman in the House of Representatives during the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, 1846, 7, 8. And he opposed the Mexican-American War because he viewed it was an unjust war that we started. We talked about that. So Abraham Lincoln is the man who will become president in 1860 and lead the nation through the Civil War and then be assassinated right at its very end. So with all this going on with slavery, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he decides he's going to go back into politics because he highly opposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And you should be able to guess what political party he joins. That's the Republican Party. So he opposes the spread of slavery into new territories. So he's going to run for Senate in his home state of Illinois. He's going to run against Stephen Douglas, the man who we referred to in the first lecture who created the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So clashing views here. So again, notice the date, 1858. This is very close to the outbreak of the Civil War. So in this debate, they were mostly arguing about the rights of slaves and black citizens, well, free blacks living in the North. Technically, according to the Supreme Court, they weren't citizens. They debated these things, popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas said that he supported popular sovereignty, that individual states, people who live there, should be able to decide if slavery would be practiced there or not. And he accused Abraham Lincoln of promoting full equality for African Americans. And that was something that was pretty controversial. Lincoln firmly believed and stated that slavery was wrong. Not that he wanted to kill it out where it was already, but that he definitely wanted to stop it from spreading any further. And he did make it clear that African Americans were entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They're guaranteed to every American at this time. And, to us, that's not radical at all. At this time, that's very radical to have said. And so, he lost about half of the nation's support right then and there. So very two conflicting views here. So they're debating for who's going to win the Senate seat. And in the end, Stephen Douglas wins. He wins the Senate seat. But what this does is it propels Abraham Lincoln to national presence and will help him win nomination and future election to President of the United States, which will actually be the very sparking tipping point of the South seceding, because they view him, Abraham Lincoln, as a radical who will eradicate slavery and bring full equality to African Americans in the United States, which is something that Southerners did not want. But this debate propels him to national prominence. One of the final events that occurs right 1859, so we're talking real close to the start of the Civil War. John Brown, the guy who brutally murdered 5 pro-slavery men in Kansas during the territorial period where they're fighting over whether it'll be a free state or slave state. He comes into national play again, this time, though, back east in Virginia. So John Brown, who's a very determined abolitionist, gathers a group of men, and he decides that he is going to go free some slaves in the South. And he goes to Harper's Ferry. Harper's Ferry held a U.S. Army arsenal full of weapons, a stockpile of weapons. And his plan was to seize guns and to arm slaves and start a slave rebellion in the South. Unfortunately, he was not successful. He was actually captured by the future leader of the Confederate Army, Robert E. Lee. Many of his followers were shot and killed, including one of his sons. And he will be captured and put on trial. When he's on trial, he makes it very clear that God had instructed him to denounce slavery and attack it and defeat it. And he even said at the end that he believed that the evil of slavery could not be purged from this nation without the shedding of blood. He kind of predicted the Civil War in 1859. During his trial, he was actually accused and convicted of treason against the United States and was hanged that same year. Well, this set off another reaction within the United States. In the North, this painting quite depicts it well, and I'll show you a very opposite reaction later. Northerners praised John Brown as a martyr, essentially, for his attempt to leave a slave revolt. He was a national hero for trying to help get rid of slavery. And they mourned his death. They say church bells rang after he was hanged. In the South is a different story. So here he is, a very kind and generous looking old man, kissing an African American child. goes along with this description. But here's another view of John Brown. Southerners saw that he was part of the North. The crazed abolitionist movement set out to destroy their way of life, their institution of slavery.